right. So thank you for that introduction and for what has been a really excellent conference so far. Some really great conversation. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak about a tangential piece of my research. My larger project uses critical discourse analysis and critical security studies to examine the relationship between UN peacekeeping operations and international humanitarian assistance organizations during the Bosnian War. My interest in how the use of language affects different frameworks for intervention and how those often competing frameworks affect the relationship between organizations led me to this limited case study, front page reports from the New York Times about women in the siege of Sarajevo. So just the briefest of timelines here. Following the SDS boycott of the independence referendum on February 29th, March 1st, 1992, violence erupted in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. By April 6th, SDS forces had taken up positions in the hills surrounding Sarajevo, and the longest siege in modern warfare had begun. In June 1992, UN peacekeeping forces took control of the Sarajevo airport and opened it to humanitarian aid flights. Throughout the siege, security concerns forced the closure of the airport on a number of occasions. And by the end of the siege in late 1995, approximately 11,000 Sarajevans had been killed. That's Sarajevan civilians. In the context of the siege, men, women, and children were equal targets, as no demographic had a greater or lesser ability to dodge sniper fire or avoid the large artillery barrages being thrown back and forth. However, on the front page of the New York Times, women in Sarajevo were portrayed predominantly as more passive victims and less contributory to resistance and the survival of the city than their male counterparts. Of course, the media representation of actors in Bosnia was not static, and this study is meant to be merely illustrative of one of the many ways that the mainstream American press portrayed not only women but civilians during the Bosnian conflict. So women's passivity was constructed on the front page in 4 primary ways. There's a foregrounding of the experience of elderly women, linking women to the innocence of children, denying women's agency in actively participating in combat roles, and reinforcing women's place within the traditional family. With my remaining time, I'd like to discuss in a little bit more detail how the linking of women to the innocence of children and sort of the equating women and children work to create an understanding of women for American audiences as not actively engaged in their own protection and resistance, and how this fed into the United States' understanding of itself on the world stage and its role in the conflict as a whole. So a lofty goal for the next 8 minutes. There's a long history of equating the experience of women and children in war. It's a practice that perhaps made sense when wars were comprised of defined battles that took place in spaces further removed from civilian involvement. Even then, however, I would argue that to deny adult women's roles as active supporters or resistors in war, and of the work done on the home front to make waging war possible, or as frontline personnel, does a disservice to our understanding of the evolution of violent conflict. Children, on the other hand, hold a really unique place in our conceptions of war, as they symbolize pure innocence. They have no place in the political machinations of the elite. They have no legitimate role in the military establishment, and their protection is dependent on the actions of adults around them. They can be largely characterized as victims of war without needing to provide any kind of caveat. Adult women, however, do play an active role in society in the decision-making process before, during, and after conflict. Though patriarchal societal structures may affect the extent of women's roles, to equate their participation to that of children is at best a lazy historical analysis, and at worst dismissive of the importance of the private sphere and ignorant of the bidirectional relationship between the public and the private. So jumping into the analysis here, one of the ways that the New York Times relegated women to the role of children in need of protection was by separating women and children from groups of war-affected individuals who are assumed to be men. When it was noted, as often happened, and this is just one example, that groups of people included women and children, there was a tacit understanding in that men were active agents of war. Even when the men in question were civilians, reporters deemed it necessary to link women and children and spotlight their victimhood as something separate from the men. The implication here is that men are supposed to be victims of war, even when they are non-combatants, whereas women and children are not supposed to be victims, and that the death of an adult woman is morally equivalent to that of a child. As Carol Mann writes in La Résistance de Femmes de Sarajevo, female non-combatants played an integral role in the protection of the city in their role reinventing society and home life under siege. As Mann argues, to merely protect the physicality of the city was not enough. Sarajevans needed to protect life in the city, and this fell primarily on the shoulders of women. As such, by linking adult women and children together on the front page, the New York Times was tacitly dismissing the valuable role women played as resistance actors and placing them in a passive role alongside young children. Women themselves were not titular actors on the front page of the New York Times until about 6 months into the war, when the UN sponsored an evacuation of 297 mothers and children from Sarajevo. This article presents an interesting case study into the complexity of discourse analysis and the challenges with identifying the media's representation of a demographic. The language in the article makes clear that women, and particularly mothers, are uniquely situated as needing protection from violence. The role of the mothers in this piece was to be protected by male defenders of this city in the same way that the children are meant to be protected by the adults in their lives. The photos that accompany this piece further illustrate the passivity of women that the New York Times was advertising. They capture the active participation of male soldiers as they interact with and say goodbye to their children. As you can see here, there's only one woman in all the photographs in this that accompany this piece, and she stands in the background and watches her family say goodbye. By literally placing the woman in the background, this photo depicts war as something that's happening to women rather than something that this woman is participating in. The Balkan press at the time had a more nuanced and arguably accurate representation of women during the war. Croatian newspapers, for example, ran photographs of female soldiers arriving at the front and women combatants greeting their ostensibly non-combatant boyfriends when they arrive home on leave. These images of women as combatants has a rich history in Yugoslavia that was celebrated throughout the socialist period. The female partisan fighter was both a militarized woman and, as a mother, a defender of the family and the nation. No comparable understanding existed in the American press at the time, as the existence of strong female fighters, even those whose participation is predicated on a gendered notion of motherhood, disrupted what is described as the savage victim savior narrative that was and is still fundamental to America's understanding of its role on the world stage. By the 1990s, the United States had established itself as uniquely qualified to offer protection to the world's women and children from the savage men. And if women in conflict zones were to be represented primarily as active participants, then the conflict narrative to which American audiences had become familiar would no longer be appropriate. And if that narrative is no longer appropriate, then that would cast questions onto the US's role on the world stage. Though the United States had won the Cold War, the post-war security apparatus had not yet been defined by the 1990s, and the United States was not yet prepared to call into question a narrative structure that supported internal notions of its own hegemony. Women played valuable and active roles in the protection of the city during the siege of Sarajevo, both as combatants and non-combatants. On the front page of the New York Times, however, these contributions existed on the periphery as the image of the passive female victim became the dominant narrative. Women were portrayed as continuing to sit in gardens with children, organizing gift giving at holidays, and take walks through the city's shopping centers, even as their city crumbled around them. And these activities were presented through the lens of passivity and resignation to fate, not that of resistance. In many ways, it's possible to read women's representation as a stand-in for Bosnia itself. The New York Times coverage of the war in general focused a great deal on international political negotiations with the United States and major European powers being portrayed as the main drivers of peace, while the role of the Bosnian government was relegated to one of participant without agency. As American administrations grappled with how best to respond to the conflict, the plight of women was a convenient way through which to frame the national discussion and justify the resultant humanitarian-focused response. Women as victims of war is not a new concept. However, the different ways that the media conceptualize this role and the way that it is manipulated to garner support or not for intervention warrants further analysis. Thank you very much. Thanks for being here on a beautiful Friday afternoon. And that's